The medieval world was a landscape where fear and faith walked side by side, indistinguishable as silhouettes at dusk. To modern eyes, it is easy to imagine that myths thrived because people were ignorant, superstitious, or too frightened to question tradition. But those who lived in the Middle Ages were not passive recipients of fantasy. They were survivors, observers, experimenters hidden behind symbols. Every belief, no matter how strange, was born from a desperate need to understand a world that seemed determined to take life rather than sustain it. Across Europe, dawn never arrived empty-handed. It brought frost that clung to roofs like crystal claws. It brought fog that moved like living memory between cottages. It brought diseases that woke faster than the villagers who feared them. In an age where a scratch could become a grave, where hunger followed winter like a shadow, and where the invisible forces of nature dictated everything, humans clung to the only compass they had: myth. What appears today as a collection of bizarre assumptions, humors flowing in the body, mists carrying death, stars guiding the crop cycles, were for medieval people frameworks for survival. They did not see their beliefs as metaphors, but as maps. The world was a puzzle with missing pieces, and myths were the glue that kept the fragments from breaking apart completely. In villages of timber and smoke, families woke to routines shaped not by convenience, but by cosmic logic. A child was fed warm broth, not because nutrition science demanded it, but because the family believed warmth helped a sluggish humor regain its strength. A farmer planted seeds on a waxing moon, not because he trusted the sky blindly, but because countless ancestors had done the same and survived long enough to pass down the method. And in the cities, cramped, pungent, teeming, the smell of burning herbs filled the streets not to charm spirits, but to push back the very real plagues hiding in sewage, animals, and air thick with filth. In such a world, a myth was not just a story, it was infrastructure. Travelers who crossed borders of kingdoms described Europe as a continent divided by languages, yet united by a shared tapestry of sacred misconceptions. In the British Isles, people hung fragrant bundles of rosemary above doors, convinced they repelled illness. In the German principalities, people lined windows with juniper branches, believing the smoke protected against devils. In the Italian city-states, physicians carried pomanders filled with spices, pressing them to their noses as if the scent itself were armor. And strangely, impossibly, many of these people lived because they believed. Behind the thick walls of monasteries, monks copied ancient manuscripts, confident that plants shaped like organs were divine clues. In their gardens, herbs grew in neat rows, each classified under God's mysterious system of design. In the minds of these scholars, they were not simply tending to plants, they were participating in a sacred dialogue between creation and cure. And while their theories were often misguided, their methods, meticulous cataloguing, trial and error, systematic observation, would blossom centuries later into fields of medicine, pharmacology, and botany. But at the heart of medieval survival lay something even more profound. Collective cooperation forged through belief. Inside workshops thick with dust, artisans prayed to patron saints before lighting their forges or threading their looms. Not because the saints spoke back, but because belief itself held their guilds together. Faith created rules, rules created quality, quality built trust, trust built economies. In a world without insurance, without social safety nets, without guarantees of fairness or stability, these mythical guardians became silent administrators of entire professions. And somewhere beyond all of this, past the village, past the smoke, past the walls of stone and the roads of mud, stood the lone pilgrim, tired, fevered, fragile. He walked because he believed movement itself could save him. Perhaps a relic would heal him. Perhaps a distant shrine held answers. But in truth, the journey was the cure. Clean water from mountain springs, fresh air away from crowded towns, rest in monastic inns, and the inevitable strengthening of the body through the long miles he endured. Faith pushed him to travel, but the road itself restored him. For medieval people, myth was not a prison. It was a scaffold, a structure that held them up when knowledge failed, a bridge between terror and understanding, a shield against an unpredictable universe. Their world was filled with dangers, but it was also filled with imagination. And imagination in the medieval mind was not decoration. It was a tool, a defense, a logic in disguise, and thus begins the secret history of Europe's most life-saving myths. Not as errors, but as survival strategies coded in symbolism. Strategies that carried entire generations through centuries of hunger, sickness, cold, and war. The medieval physician lived in a world without microscopes, without anatomical knowledge, and without the faintest idea that bacteria even existed. And yet, he stood at the front lines of survival, armed with nothing but intuition, ancient teachings, and a worldview where the body was governed by 4 invisible forces. To him, a human being was not a structure of flesh and bone. It was a delicate vessel filled with 4 sacred humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These fluids, mythic, symbolic, almost spiritual, shaped everything: health, personality, emotion, even destiny. If a man was quick-tempered, the physician saw too much yellow bile. If he was melancholic and slow-moving, black bile was the culprit. If a woman was flushed, energetic, and passionate, her blood was abundant. If she was pale, lethargic, and cold, phlegm dominated her nature. It was a cosmic logic, and yet an unexpectedly practical one. Because to restore this balance of fluids, medieval healers crafted remedies that were surprisingly effective, not by scientific intention, but by accidental wisdom preserved through myth. In candlelit rooms that smelled of herbs and smoke, physicians mixed ingredients gathered from fields, forests, markets, and monastery gardens. They burned rosemary for warmth, used mint to calm nausea, boiled onions to break fevers, and prescribed garlic to strengthen the body against winter illnesses. These choices were based on humoral philosophy, yet they often aligned, and by sheer luck, with real medicinal effects. To warm a cold and melancholic patient, they served spicy or hot foods rich in calories. To soothe overheated bile, they offered broths, cooling herbs, and hydration. To strengthen a weakened spirit, they recommended rest, sunlight, gentle movement, and nutrient-rich meals long before nutrition science existed. Daily life revolved around this belief. Entire communities adjusted their diets, their activities, and their seasonal habits according to the rise and fall of humours. Children grew up learning which foods heated the blood and which cooled it. Farmers timed their work according to the logic of the body. Housewives stored ingredients by symbolic properties, not understanding chemistry, but understanding survival. The beliefs may sound fantastical today, but they pushed medieval society to vary foods throughout the year, preventing extreme deficiencies. They taught people to listen to physical sensations and adapt long before modern wellness existed. For the physician, the 4 humours were not superstition. They were the best available map of the body. A flawed one, yes, but still better than wandering without direction. Private homes became tiny clinics where families practiced simple forms of preventive care: warm compresses for stiff joints, herbal teas for digestive issues, sweating therapies for fevers, balanced meals to counteract imbalances. At night, villagers gathered around hearths while elders recited remedies passed down for generations. These were not just cures, they were part of the folklore of survival. And in the great stone cities, physicians wearing long robes and carrying leather-bound manuscripts walked from door to door like guardians of the fragile human condition. They observed patients with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. They believed every cough, every flush of the face, every twitch of the pulse was a message from the humours whispering beneath the skin. In university towns like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, scholars debated the movements of these invisible fluids for hours beneath vaulted ceilings. Their theories were sometimes wildly incorrect, yet the methods they created for studying the human body formed the earliest foundations of Western medical practice. Even the controversy surrounding bloodletting, a practice that sometimes harmed but occasionally helped, was born from the belief that disease was an excess that needed release. Though dangerous, the idea came from a genuine desire to rebalance the body's state. What makes the medieval physician extraordinary is not his accuracy, but his persistence. He fought an unbeatable enemy, the disease, with a toolkit made of metaphor. And still, remarkably, he managed to improve the lives of those who trusted him. Because beneath the myths, there was something real, a culture that encouraged rest, hydration, balanced diet, herbal remedies, and constant self-observation. A system that, despite its mystical costumes, pushed communities toward healthier habits. And in those dimly lit chambers, where sickness spread through cities like wildfire, the physician of humors stood as the fragile barrier between life and death, guided by myths that, in ways he would never know, were helping more than harming. It is easy to laugh at the medieval doctor, but the truth is more complicated. Behind the myths lay the first blueprint of medicine. A blueprint flawed, yes, but indispensable. In the medieval world, work was not merely labor, it was identity, protection, pride, and often the thin line between starvation and survival. But life was unpredictable, and a single accident, illness, or fire could ruin an entire family. Out of this uncertainty grew one of the most powerful and misunderstood myth-driven systems of survival: the cult of the patron saints of craftsmen. To many modern eyes, this reverence looks like innocent superstition. A blacksmith whispering a prayer to St. Dunstan before hammering iron, a carpenter hanging an image of St. Joseph above his bench, a weaver keeping St. Anne carved into the lintel of her workshop. But in the Middle Ages, this was not just ritual. It was the foundation of the earliest social safety nets ever built in Europe. Inside workshops glowing with the heat of furnaces, littered with sawdust, or soaked with dyes and tannins, craftsmen believed their work was watched over by holy protectors. These saints were not distant mythic figures. They were woven into daily routines like invisible mentors. Their presence defined standards, ethics, and obligations. A blacksmith did not simply make horseshoes. He made them under the moral gaze of a saint who demanded quality. A mason did not merely carve stones. He carved them as part of a sacred tradition older than his own memory. A potter did not shape clay for profit alone. He shaped it because his craft was part of a divine calling. But this spiritual framework had consequences far more practical than spiritual. It forged guilds, the first powerful labor organizations in European history. Guilds were born from mythic reverence, but quickly grew into disciplined machines that protected their members better than kings protected their soldiers. They standardized wages, set quality controls, prevented price gouging, trained apprentices, funded funerals and weddings, and created emergency funds for widows and orphans. A craftsman who prayed to his patron saint was also silently renewing a vow to his guild brothers. We rise together. If one falls, none of us stands idle. In candlelit halls beneath tapestries depicting their sacred protectors, guild members made pacts stronger than iron. They agreed that no child of a guild brother would ever go hungry. They agreed that no widow would be abandoned. They agreed that no apprentice would be mistreated, no tool would be forged poorly, no price would be unfair. These were not the fantasies of pious workers. They were the building blocks of medieval urban stability. In a world where famine, plague, and war were constant threats, these rituals preserved entire communities. When a craftsman fell sick, guild brothers arrived at his door carrying food, firewood, and occasionally apprentices who would continue his work so his family could survive. When disaster struck, a roof collapsing, a workshop burning down, the guild rebuilt it. When a member died, leaving behind a wife and small children, the guild stepped in as guardian, educator, provider. These acts were not acts of charity. They were obligations, embedded within the cult-like devotion to their patron saints. The saint demanded loyalty not only to heaven, but to each other. Competition between craftsmen did not vanish, but it transformed. Rivals were brothers, competitors were comrades. A shared myth kept them aligned, disciplined, and united. Guilds also enforced quality like no other institution. If one craftsman betrayed the standards of his saint, using poor materials, lying about measurements, or deceiving customers, he risked punishment not from heaven, but from the guild itself. Fines, exile, or the loss of his workshop were very real consequences. Myth set the rules, human hands enforced them. And beyond economics, guilds shaped culture. They hosted feasts, seasonal festivals, parades honoring their saints, and symbolic rituals welcoming new apprentices. With every oath taken beneath a carved image of their protector, the emotional bond between members deepened. In a world without government assistance, without hospitals for common workers, without standardized education or pensions, guilds were the only institutions that guaranteed survival. But there was something else, something more subtle and profoundly human. These brotherhoods gave medieval workers dignity. A blacksmith in the 1300s could spend his entire life inside the same smoky workshop. His hands would blister, scar, and eventually deform from years of shaping metal. But he did not see himself as merely a laborer. Through the lens of myth, he saw himself as an heir to a sacred lineage, as part of a tribe of craftsmen whose work connected them to a divine order. That belief, that he was part of something holy, something ancient, something larger than himself, gave him purpose during winters of hardship, plagues that wiped out half his street, or wars that stole friends and sons. His faith in a patron saint was not only spiritual comfort, it was psychological armor. The mythology binding craftsmen together also created the first proto-insurance systems, the first standardized apprenticeships, the first independent municipal authorities, and even the first regulated markets. From superstition, structure emerged. From myth, society was organized. From devotion, economic stability was born. And so, in the dim glow of a medieval workshop, where hammers sang like bells and chisels whispered through wood, the craftsman was not simply surviving the harsh realities of medieval life. He was mastering them through faith, through unity, through myth. The patron saints never descended from heaven to bless these workshops, but in a way, they didn't need to. Their legend had already done the job. As the Middle Ages progressed, trade flourished, cities expanded, and craftsmen found themselves at the center of an economic transformation. Workshops multiplied, markets grew louder, coins clinked in taverns and counting houses, and with this prosperity, guilds became something more than associations of workers. They became Bindu power, not just symbolic power, real power. In cities like Florence, Ghent, London, and Lubeck, guilds controlled prices, influenced laws, and negotiated directly with rulers. Some guilds even commanded militias, patrolled streets, or funded fortifications. Their banners flew beside those of nobles. Their leaders sat on councils. Their approval could make or break a merchant, an artisan, or even a bishop. But with power came tension, between guild members and outsiders, between innovation and tradition, and between spiritual ideals and worldly ambition. This is where the myth of patron saints began to transform again, taking on a deeper and more dramatic role. The rising tensions. For centuries, guild identity rested on brotherhood and protection, but by the 14th century, as wealth increased, so did competition. Cities were crowded, resources were limited, markets were fierce battlegrounds, and for the first time the guild's strict rules, meant to protect craftsmen, became barriers for ambitious newcomers. Journeymen wandered from city to city seeking work, only to be turned away because guilds demanded fees they could not afford. Young apprentices grew restless as masters delayed their advancement to protect their own profits. And merchants, especially those dealing in mass-produced goods, threatened traditional craftsmanship with cheaper alternatives. These tensions simmered beneath the surface, and in many cities, violence erupted. Journeymen revolted in Augsburg. Cloth workers rioted in Flanders. In Paris, butchers and leather workers clashed in the streets, and guild halls were set on fire. In Florence, wool workers, the Ciompi, staged a full-scale uprising. Amid all this turbulence, the guilds rallied around the one thing no outsider could touch: their saints. Through feast days, processions, sermons, and symbolic rituals, guild leaders used myth to restore unity and control. The saint became more than a protector. The saint became an enforcer of order, but not everyone accepted this. First, the fire of betrayal. In many guilds there was a ritual, almost universal, performed in secret rooms illuminated by flickering lanterns, a ritual that every apprentice, journeyman, and master knew, but never spoke of publicly. The Soth of the Craft. A young apprentice would kneel before a panel of masters, the workshop tools, Hammer, chisel, plane, needle, or compass were laid out before him like sacred relics. An image of the guild's patron saint loomed nearby, its eyes dim in the candlelight. The apprentice swore loyalty to the craft, to the guild, and to the saint who watched over both. He promised never to reveal secrets of the trade, never to cheat customers, never to undercut prices, never to betray a brother craftsman. Breaking that oath meant exile at best, and ruin at worst. But in one documented case kept alive by oral tradition and local archives, a master broke the oath spectacularly. In 1392, in the city of Strasbourg, a renowned goldsmith named Albrecht von Reinhausen began secretly dealing with foreign merchants who sought cheaper, faster production. He used alloys of poor quality, disguised imperfections, and passed off inferior jewelry as masterpieces. His profits soared, his fame grew, but his betrayal threatened the reputation and survival of the entire guild. When the guild discovered the truth, outrage ignited like a spark in dry timber, and the response was harsh. Albrecht's workshop was seized, his tools were smashed. His mark, the identifying signature stamped into every precious piece, was legally erased from the city's registry. And in front of his burned workshop, the guild performed a public ritual. They gathered his faulty works, melted them in a great crucible, and poured the molten gold onto the ground, symbolically purifying the craft he had corrupted. The message was unmistakable. The craft may bend under pressure, but it will not break, not while the oath stands, not while the saint watches. And just like that, the myth regained its iron grip on the hearts of craftsmen. The moral burden. But myth is a double-edged sword. While saints inspired unity, discipline, and quality, they also imposed heavy burdens. 1. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. A new technique, a strange tool. Many masters feared that innovation might be seen as defiance of tradition, an insult to the saint who defined their craft. 2. Outsiders were treated like threats. Foreign artisans, ambitious journeymen, and rural workers often faced hostility, regardless of talent. 3. Guilds became gatekeepers of opportunity. Rising to the rank of master required money, reputation, and approval, things many hard-working craftsmen never gained. 4. Myth justified strict punishments. Expulsion, blacklisting, and ritual-shaming ceremonies were seen as holy acts of purification. The same belief that protected workers also trapped them in rigid hierarchies. Size was the unbreakable thread. And yet, despite conflicts, punishments, rivalries, and political struggles, something extraordinary persisted. The craftsman's identity remained sacred. Whether carving stone, forging iron, weaving cloth, or binding books, medieval artisans believed they carried a spark of divine purpose. Their craft was not just work, it was destiny. Their guild was not just an institution, it was family. Their saint was not just a symbol, he was the soul of the tradition. And through these beliefs, through these stories, through these rituals, the medieval working world survived plague, war, famine, political chaos, and economic upheaval. Because the bond between myth and labor, between the sacred and the practical, was stronger than any hardship, stronger than fire, stronger than betrayal, stronger than time itself. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, as plagues swept across the continent, and as warbands scarred the soil of Europe, there was one force, quiet, unseen, yet astonishingly durable, that held medieval society together. Not kings, not armies, not priests, but the guilds. Those intricate brotherhoods whose myths and rituals shaped every step of daily survival. At first glance, the guild appeared to be nothing more than a professional association, a collection of weavers, masons, smiths, apothecaries, and carpenters organizing their craft. But to the medieval mind, it was far more than that. It was a spiritual institution, a moral compass, a secret network of protection, and though no chronicler of the time dared say it aloud, the closest thing the Middle Ages had to social welfare. Their world was dangerous. A single accident could leave a family destitute. A fire could reduce a workshop to ash. illness could erase years of mastery. That was why every guild had something extraordinary at its core, a mythic protector, a saintly figure whose story defined the identity and responsibilities of every artisan beneath its banner. The masons whispered about Saint Blaise, the patient stone tender who healed the sick through humble labor. The weavers followed. Saint Anastasia, who legend claimed stitched healing cloth from thread, touched by moonlight. The blacksmiths revered St. Dunstan, who bound the devil with iron tongs, an image burned into the collective imagination of craftsmen who fought both fire and fate. To the modern eye, these tales seem fanciful, but in medieval Europe, these myths were the glue that held an entire economic ecosystem together. They established an invisible code of honor that governed how apprentices learned, how masters taught, and how craftsmanship passed safely from generation to generation. Every guild hall, thick-beamed, soot-darkened, and scented with wax, was a fortress of ritual. Candles burned beneath the guild's emblem. Oaths were spoken not in legalese, but in the language of myth. The new apprentice pledged loyalty before the relic of the guild's patron, promising to uphold the craft, the brotherhood, and the sacred wisdom of the hands. It was a ceremony so powerful that many who witnessed it later said they felt as if the tools themselves were watching. The hammer, the needle, the chisel, the loom, guardians of secrets older than any king. This mystique wasn't accidental. It was necessary. It kept outsiders from stealing techniques, kept prices stable, protected the quality of work, and ensured that no craftsman, no matter how poor, worked entirely alone. But beneath the incense, prayers, and ritual gestures lay something far more practical. Mutual aid. If a carpenter fell ill, the guild paid his rent. If a blacksmith broke his arm, the guild fed his family. If a master died unexpectedly, the guild adopted his son as an apprentice and ensured his widow received support. These weren't acts of charity, they were survival strategies disguised as sacred duty. The guild's mythic structure transformed practical organization into something emotionally irresistible. People obeyed rules not because they feared punishment, but because they feared disappointing the saint, who symbolized their craft. They kept standards high not for profit, but to honor the mythic origin of their tools. And when disputes arose, they were settled under the watchful eyes, real or imagined, of their patron protector. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn, and one rarely told in mainstream medieval history. As these brotherhoods grew more complex, many of their myths began blending with older pre-Christian traditions. In the candle-lit corners of certain guild halls, especially among masons, metalworkers, and glassmakers, whispers survived about the first craftsman, a primordial figure said to have taught humans how to shape the world. Some called him Tubal-Cain, others Wayland the Smith, others simply the Master of Masters. These half-forgotten legends led to rites meant to encourage excellence, secrecy, and unity, rites that blurred the line between practical training and spiritual initiation. And while historians debate the truth behind these rituals, the fact remains that guild culture produced Europe's most skilled builders, engineers, and artisans. But their influence reached even further. Guilds accidentally improved medieval or public health because they enforced rules for cleanliness and tool maintenance. They improved food safety because bakers and butchers policed quality with surprising ferocity. They strengthened urban stability because guilds negotiated peace between rival workshops and even mediated political disputes. Some cities like Cologne, Bruges, and Ghent were effectively run by guild coalitions more than by their official lords. The myths gave the guilds moral authority. The guilds gave the people protection. And together, they shaped the destiny of medieval Europe. Their greatest legacy, though, is perhaps the one most invisible today. Through their rituals, their myths, and their stubborn insistence on excellence, guilds preserved something priceless: the dignity of work. In an age where survival was uncertain, they taught generations that craftsmanship mattered, that the hands of ordinary laborers could leave extraordinary marks on the world, stone by stone, thread by thread, hammer blow by hammer blow, the cathedrals we marvel at today, the illuminated manuscripts, the tapestries, the ironwork, the carved timber beams. They are all in a way relics of these brotherhoods, relics of a time when myth and method fused so tightly that it was impossible to separate belief from survival. And perhaps that is why the mythology of the guilds has endured for centuries, echoing into our modern world. The idea that behind every craft lies a story, behind every tool a legacy, behind every tradition a guardian watching over its people. In the end, the myths of the guilds, just like the myths of miasma, humoral balance, celestial agriculture and herb lore, were not mere superstitions. They were survival systems disguised as sacred truths, strategies wrapped in symbolism, knowledge encoded in faith, a final lesson from a world where life was fragile, but community was strong. Myths kept people alive, brotherhoods kept people safe, and the hands of the many, guided by stories older than memory, built a civilization capable of enduring the darkest of ages.